I stared at the 3 pins that still stood at the end of the lane while I waited for the machine to return my bowling ball. I'm usually pretty good at bowling, but not today. When I divorced my wife Susan a year ago, it wasn't easy, but little by little, it got better. Now I can go weeks without even thinking about it. But then it pops back into my head, and depression settles over me. Tonight was one of those nights. After my ball popped up and rolled to a stop, I picked it up, twirling it in my hands. I felt the writing. The orb reminds me of happy times when my wife hadn't yet had a lover, but I couldn't think about that now. Even though I had played poorly so far, we could still win if I took that spare ball and hit at least 5 pins with my last throw. Today's match was semi-important. We were playing against the first-place team. If we win, we'll be the first-place team. After the first ball, 4, 5, and 7 pins were still standing. Picking up a spare wouldn't be a problem. All I had to do was place the ball between the 4th and 5th pins. I inserted my fingers into the holes and positioned myself in front of the correct pin. Being left-handed, I tried to give the ball a slight spin to make it curve in the direction I wanted. However, I must have given the ball too much rotation because it only pulled out the 5 and 7 pins. The 5-pin ball wobbled for a second but stayed in place. The other team rose from their seats and applauded. There was only a groan from my side. "Jesus, John, how could you miss that?" Phil grabbed his head as we sat back and drank our beers. "Stuff happens," I said with a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "Besides, we're already in 2nd place and we have 2 more chances to take 1st. We're playing against the last and penultimate team in our league. The Golden Dragons will have to play against the 3rd and 5th place teams, and they've already lost to both of them." "Yeah, but we could have taken 1st place today." Phil wasn't going to be discouraged. "We could have. We should have," he muttered. "Phil, let it go," I said, starting to get annoyed. An awkward silence ensued as all 4 of us sipped our beers and tried to pretend there was no tension in the air. I studied my teammates, Phil, Rick, and Mark. Phil was 45 years old, 50 pounds overweight, had gray hair, and a disheveled beard. Phil was the assistant manager of the power plant. Mark was 41 years old and owned his own tool and die company. Mark was only 5 feet 7 inches tall, had short brown hair, and considered himself a ladies' man. In that respect, Mark was a legend in his own mind. In reality, he dated sporadically, and his few long-term relationships usually ended badly. His last girlfriend had dumped him because, in her opinion, Mark was too clingy. Rick was just over 6 feet tall, with dirty blonde hair that he kept a little long. He owned an accounting service, and his wife Anna was a stay-at-home mom. "So, what's new with your old lady?" asked Mark with a smirk that annoyed me even more. "I don't have an old lady. I'm divorced," I replied, trying not to give away my irritation, and asked the waitress to bring us 4 more mugs of beer. We had a tradition. If we lost a match, the player with the lowest score had to buy the first 2 rounds. The same was true if we won. Since it was rare for any of us to have more than 2 drinks, the loser paid for everyone's drinks that evening. When the beer arrived, Phil and Rick got into a discussion about the NFL. I'm more interested in college soccer, so I wasn't paying too much attention. Apparently, Phil and Rick were discussing what game they would be watching this Sunday. Their wives don't like it when they watch soccer all day. Then Mark cut in and said he could watch soccer all he wanted. He then looked at me and said, "John, you blew it yourself. You were free of that and could watch soccer all you wanted and do whatever you wanted, and now you're back under her power." "Yeah." Phil picked up on that. "I'll never understand why you didn't burn that for what she did. I also don't understand why you didn't beat the crap out of her boyfriend. After all, Susan basically told you she was in love with a younger guy and was sleeping with him. She basically told you that you weren't good enough. How could you let her back in the house?" "Stop!" I shouted, standing up abruptly, causing my chair to fly backward. "Calm down, John," Rick hissed, "or they'll call the cops." "You guys?" I spat out and headed for the parking lot. All 3 caught up with me in the parking lot, but Phil spoke first. "Look, John, we didn't mean anything by it. No, you guys did, I said, turning to face them. You and a lot of others have been screwing with me for over a year now. I'll admit, when things went south, I was willing to listen to all the nasty things that were poured out on Susan. She deserved it, but now I'm sick of it. You guys don't know a damn thing about what my family and I have been through. Phil had a hangnail in his ass that night. He was in a fighting mood. All I know is that Susan came out of that situation as fragrant as a rose. She had a few months of fun with some young guy, and now she's got her kids back, her parents back, and she's living in the family home. She's almost got you back, too. Like I said, she smells like a rose. Phil, you have instead of brains, I said, turning to leave. Then tell me where I'm wrong. Phil threw in. Okay, I said, suddenly turning back around. I'm gonna tell you guys why you're all so full of it. After this, if any of you talk about Susan or divorce one more time, we're screwed. Do you hear where I'm going with this? Phil and Mark nodded quickly. Rick looked around awkwardly. I sensed he was uncomfortable with this whole conversation. I knew for a fact that he and his wife were going through a rough patch. It almost came to divorce. Rick's wife is a beautiful woman with blonde hair and a great figure. Rick is also a good-looking guy. Apparently, Rick had an affair with a woman from his office, and Anna had an affair with a neighbor in retaliation. They both filed for divorce, but neither of them could pull the trigger. Perhaps having 2 children had something to do with it, but I suspect that deep down they still loved each other. Mark has never been married and has been dumped by his last 3 girlfriends. Despite this, he considers himself a player. In fact, he knows nothing about serious relationships. Phil, on the other hand, has been married for 15 years. His wife, Linda, weighs about 300 pounds and is a bit grumpy. They have 5 children, but if they ever loved each other, it doesn't show now. It always seemed to me that if Phil was on fire and there was a box of chocolates across the street, Linda would go get the chocolates before doing anything for Phil. But on the other hand, if there was a 6-pack of beer on the other side of the street and Linda was on fire, no doubt Phil would have gone for the beer first. He would later say he went for the beer to put out the fire. Of course, I'm sure he planned to run it through his kidneys first. Finally, Rick nodded, but then added, John, you don't owe us any explanations. You're absolutely right. We shouldn't have said anything about your divorce. I saw Phil and Mark glaring daggers at him. They were hoping to hear some dirt on Susan or confirmation that I was a wuss.
No.
Let's get it out in the open, and then I'll never want to hear about it again, I said. Mark and Phil smiled and nodded. Rick nodded somewhat reluctantly. Let's start with the issue that caused my divorce, I began. I'm sure you've heard all the stories. I've heard them all, and some of them are pretty close to the truth. I'm sure you already know that Susan caught me off guard one day and told me that she had fallen in love with a young man. She claimed that she still loved me, but she also liked this guy. In her imagination, Susan saw this guy as a sort of wounded bird, and her plan was to cure him. Susan admitted to having sex with him and said that she would continue to have sex with him until he withdrew. As you can imagine, I was furious. I wanted to pounce on her, but I got drunk instead. I saw Rick start to squirm and his face turn red. It looked like this story was making him very uncomfortable, but I decided to continue anyway. Maybe it would be a little help for him in keeping his wedding vows. For his sake, I hope so. No one should have to go through what I had to go through. Then I asked her how she would feel about me starting to have sex with another woman. Susan said I was a middle-aged, overweight man with thinning hair and no one would want to take me on. Susan threatened to ruin me if I filed for divorce.
Jesus, John fio interrupted.
If my wife said that to me, I'd kill her, and you'd be in jail for the rest of your life with no one to take care of your kids. I snapped back and continued. Truth be told, the thought has crossed my mind, but only in passing. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't live with her infidelity. I decided to file for divorce. Fortunately, I found a great lawyer. He drew up the deck in my favor as best he could. Fortunately for me, Susan was completely detached from reality. He got me to stay in the house, got custody of the kids, and Susan even had to pay child support. I got my half of the property and even got a temporary restraining order so Susan couldn't get within 500 feet of us. Sounds like you had it under control. John, Mark said, shaking his head. Why did you let her off the hook? Susan wasn't off the hook, I said calmly. And she didn't come out of that situation a fragrant rose. How can you say that? Mark protested. She had an affair and she got her old life back. And you got nothing. God, you don't understand anything, Mark, I said, shaking my head. To begin with, Susan had mental health issues. I probably should have brought it to her attention, but I didn't. She was severely depressed at the time. It certainly led to the affair, but that doesn't excuse what she told me. Adding to Susan's problems is that she recently found out that she has bipolar disorder and needs to take medication. There is no way she can come out of this mess a fragrant rose. To begin with, Susan has destroyed her relationship with her parents, or at least her father. Her mother has more or less forgiven her, but her father communicates with her only reluctantly. You have to realize that Susan has been a daddy's girl all her life. It kills her that her father no longer feels that special treatment. I paused for a moment to make sure they understood. Rick clearly understood. He had experienced the same pain that Susan and I had, and he was still hurting. Mark and Phil, at least, were somewhat restrained. I decided to continue. It's true, during the divorce, I made a lot of concessions that people want to criticize me for now, but they don't see it through my eyes. Susan finally realized that she made a terrible decision and destroyed our family. It torments her every day. Regardless of how I felt, I had to think about our children. This divorce was tearing them apart. John was on his way to hating his mother. I don't think Susan will ever have a normal relationship with him. He was, and I fear still has, bitterness over what his mother did. As the divorce dragged on, Sally, who was an excellent student, was on the verge of failing. At least now she's made up with her mother, but I don't think Sally will ever be able to fully trust Susan again. And Kyle, he breaks my heart. Kyle was such a happy kid before all this. Now he's quiet and timid. I pray that someday his spirit will come back to him. I know Susan is still crying about what she did to her children. Imagine having to live with that for the rest of your life. But all you got out of it was heartache and humiliation. Phil objected. If I could go back to the way things were before Susan went crazy, I'd do it in a heartbeat. But you're wrong that I got nothing out of it. Yes, and what did you get, John? Pressed Mark. Start with this. I have my own business now, and I make more money than when I worked at the dealership. I never would have separated and opened my own auto shop if Susan hadn't made all this mess. And let's not forget that I still party with my girlfriends, and Susan can't say a word because we're divorced. And yes, I sometimes stay overnight at her place, and yes, we sometimes sleep together. Neither of you have those advantages. Like I said, if I could take things back to the way they were, I would do it without a second's hesitation. When I finished, there was dead silence, and I could see that all three men were looking at my divorce in a completely different way. Okay, now you've heard the story, and I don't want to hear about it again. Ever, I said as I headed to my car. As I got behind the wheel, I headed towards my apartment, but halfway there, I changed my mind and headed towards home. I wanted to see my kids in the morning and give them a hug before they went to school. I was going to sleep in the guest room, but Susan heard me and called out, John, please sleep with me tonight. It's been a terrible day, and I really need someone to hold me. And even though I wasn't going to do it, we had sex. I don't call it making love because I don't think I still love Susan, but I know without a doubt that she still loves me deeply. The next morning, my children were surprised and happy to see me at breakfast. John's eyes lit up, and he even gave me a little hug. Sally also kissed my cheek and gave me a big hug. Kyle immediately climbed into my lap and started talking about the new video game his friend had just gotten. Near the sink, I saw Susan. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she was smiling. I think, at that moment, Susan was happier than she had ever been since everything went down. And at that moment, I have to admit, I was happy too.